Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending upon where you're logging in from. We're looking forward to today's session. Just to give you kind of a brief introduction to what Nasser and I are going to go over, this is going to be a very high-level overview and is designed to be part one of a two-part session. We're going to be doing the second part in July. So we're going to kind of cut short on some of the equal pay or pay equity concepts. So please join us in July when we kind of finish the other half of this presentation. Also, because we're trying to cram a lot of material into an hour, it is going to be a pretty high-level overview. We look forward to all of your questions. Hopefully, we'll be able to address them during the session itself. But if not, Nasser and I will definitely make sure that we answer any of your questions in written format after the presentation. So to begin with, pay equity. What is the meaning and importance behind pay equity and pay gaps and kind of the concepts around these two? So what is pay equity? Conceptually, pay equity is the practice of ensuring that employee compensation is based upon legitimate, non-discriminatory factors such as skill, effort, responsibility level, and working conditions. These factors can vary. These are just a few examples of them. But really the basic concept behind it is that are you paying people of different groups, different genders, different orientations, different protected classes equally, right? And so that's kind of the overall overview. Now we're going to get into kind of the more details of what is, what does that mean if you're not, right? So Nasser, if you can take it from here.
Yeah, sure. Morning, everybody. So kind of going on with what Max is saying, kind of the goal is to understand these high-level concepts and sort of understanding what pay equity means. It's kind of useful to understand what we mean by a pay gap, right? And people talk about pay gaps, but it's not particularly defined sometimes what they mean by it. So a lot of times there's something called a raw pay gap, right? So if you take one group and compare it to another group, for example, men versus women, and you see that there's an average pay gap between the two. What does that mean, right? Say the average earning for men in your company is 80,000, whereas women is 60,000. What does that mean, right? So the raw pay gap is how the average or median pay differs from that group, but that is composed of something called the explained pay gap and the unexplained pay gap. So the explained pay gap is sometimes these pay differences are explainable by kind of neutral factors that aren't really related to the demographic group that you're comparing it to. And so some of these could be maybe the occupation that they have as much as a higher paid role, right? Or they have more experience, or they're more educated, right? These are kind of neutral factors in explaining why one group might be paid more than another group inside a certain company. Then, aside from those, once you factor those away, then there might be an additional gap. After you sort of explain those away, there might be an additional pay gap, right? So it's that remaining pay gap that cannot be explained by compensatory factors, but maybe due to demographic related pay inequities, right? So it could be ultimately that because this group is a minority or is a woman, or could even be a majority group, that's the reason potentially why there's a kind of a pay difference there. So yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So to kind of illustrate this concept, this graph is helpful. So in this example, there's a pay gap potentially of between men and women, right? And so women earn 80 cents for every dollar a man earns, right? But in this example, the raw pay gap between men and women is driven mainly by the explained pay gap, right? With this smaller portion, 5,000 left unexplained. So in this situation, if you were to sort of have these neutral factors, you could say, hey, look, the men in this hypothetical company, they have a lot more seniority. They take on more responsibility, or they have higher education. And that's kind of the reason that's driving the compensation difference. But then in this hypothetical example, even if you were to account for that, right, there's still this $5,000 pay difference that, all right, you've controlled for all those things, but still, the women are getting paid 5,000 less, right? So the primary objective of proactive pay equity analysis is to measure an organization's unexplained pay gap and close it where appropriate.
So equal pay laws, right? So most jurisdictions globally, with a few exceptions, have some sort of law on the books that identifies an equal pay standard, right? The example here for the United States government is the Equal Pay Act, passed in the 1960s. And so we're going to go briefly into some of the differences here between the different types of standards that are implemented either at a national or a state level. Here in the United States, we have standards that apply both federally, as I said, the Equal Pay Act, but we also have state-specific standards that apply to individual jurisdictions like California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and so on. So we're just going to go briefly into kind of the different types of standards they have and how those standards kind of compare to each other from a breadth and narrowness perspective and what that means from a compliance perspective.
So broadly speaking, these laws, they kind of take shape in kind of three main categories, right? So the pay equity standards, there's three main pay equity frameworks. And then sometimes more than one can apply to a specific jurisdiction, right? So the first most standard kind of framework is something you see kind of in the Federal Equal Pay Act, which was passed in the 1960s, right? It's equal pay for identical work. Employees performing identical work must be paid equitably. Any pay differences must be able to be explained by legitimate business factors. And as you can imagine, it's really hard to prove that you're performing identical work to another individual. So a lot of times, there's kind of a struggle to really demonstrate that you deserve equal pay, because you also have to prove that you're performing identical work, right? Which is kind of one of the holdups for at the federal level, the Equal Pay Act, right? And the second category, and this is something we're kind of seeing more at the state level, is kind of a loosening, right, of this equal pay for equal work concept, right? And that's equal pay for comparable work. It's sometimes called substantially similar work. So employees performing substantially similar work must be paid equitably. Substantially similar typically means similar skills, effort, and responsibility required to perform the work. Right? And any pay differences, again, must be able to be explained by legitimate business factors. So this is something we're kind of seeing more at the state level in the United States, where different states are kind of loosening that federal standard, right? And then finally, the third concept is equal pay for work of equal value. And this is employees who are performing completely different work, but can be shown to be of equal value based on objective criteria, and they must be paid equitably. And then different jurisdictions define equal value in different ways. So this is something we're seeing a lot in Europe. And this is kind of really kind of shaking up the framework of what it means to be paid equitably, because now you have potential jobs that aren't typically compared to each other, but employers have to kind of do a ground up analysis of how they value each role, right? How do you value a secretary versus a janitor versus an accountant versus an account manager, right? And you have to assign a point value, and based on that point value, potentially you have to, make sure everyone's paid equitably. And this equal pay for work of equal value can potentially help kind of a historic undervaluation of female-dominated labor. And what that means is, baked into what job roles are is kind of potentially inherent assumptions about who takes on those roles, and they're historically potentially paid less, right? But by doing kind of a ground-up analysis of how you value each position, you potentially kind of do away with those historic inequities based on the roles.
One thing I just wanted to add to what Nasser was saying there before I talk about that next slide is that one thing not to get hung up on is the language used in defining the standards in different jurisdictions, because we're finding that different jurisdictions will use sometimes the same words, comparable, but have them mean two different things between the different jurisdictions. So those are roughly the three different types of standards we're seeing, but we're seeing different permutations of the language being used in each of those different standards, and it really just comes down to each jurisdiction defining what comparable means, what substantially similar means in that particular jurisdiction, what equal value means. So just be aware that we're laying out a framework of 3 different types of standards, but the way the jurisdictions are implementing the language to define those standards can be different. So equal pay for equal work, right? As Nasser already talked about, our federal standard here in the United States is a fairly narrow standard. One, it defines equal pay for equal work, which really is that while they don't have to be completely identical, they must be really substantially similar in jobs, right? Looking at job content is what determines whether or not they are substantially equal. The federal standard only protects discrimination based upon sex, right? It does cover all forms of compensation, right? So you could have a male and female employee who are paid exactly the same salary, but if that male employee is being given better vacation time, better other perks like gas allowances, put up in better hotel accommodations, any other types of benefits, you could still end up with inequality within the definition of the Equal Pay Act.
And trying to expand upon maybe that second standard, what we're seeing at the state level. So California recognizes a standard for equal pay for substantially similar work. The California Equal Pay Act prohibits employers from paying employees less than employees of opposite sex, of another race, or of another ethnicity for substantially similar work, right? So we see a broadening of the protected categories rather than as compared to the federal Equal Pay Act. Substantially similar work is defined as work that is mostly similar across 4 factors: skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And this is kind of a different standard than the equal work standard that's set out in the federal Equal Pay Act. And in this slide, you kind of lay out kind of the differences at a high level on what that means, right? There's more protected classes in the California Equal Pay Act. The threshold is somewhat looser and wider in terms of there's a substantially similar rather than the equal work threshold. And also specific to the California regulation is you can sort of compare your work to employees at other locations, right? Whereas the federal Equal Pay Act is looking very narrowly at employees that work in the same location. So it's definitely a much broader standard than the federal Equal Pay Act. And I kind of thought it'd be useful to kind of point out a real world example. Recently, Oracle had to settle a pay equity lawsuit for $25 million. And one of the pieces of evidence that got in that showed that people were performing, similar work is that Oracle uses something like these job codes and they assign it to different types of workers. And that was able for that lawsuit to certify a class saying, look, this is enough evidence to show that these people were kind of doing similar work and they were getting paid differently. And so the court let that through, and ultimately Oracle settled this suit for $25 million for approximately 4,000 women recently in February 2024. And I remember looking at it, and some legal analysts said, look, like they kind of got off easy. 25 million is actually, potentially not that bad. There's a Goldman Sachs lawsuit that got settled in 2023 that settlement was for $215 million for even less women than Oracle. So there's real risk in terms of being behind the ball in terms of understanding potential pay inequities at your company.
Yeah, and that just gets to the idea that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about different states' standards and the fact that they're opening up, that, we're really, with the implementation of a lot of these state laws and also kind of the expansion we're seeing in the realm of things like pay equity lawsuits, the kinds of evidence that plaintiffs are identifying and that courts are looking at to really evaluate these standards that are a little bit broader, whether or not something is substantially similar, whether or not it's comparable, right? We're seeing things like job codes coming in. Like the court is looking at a wide variety of different evidence to allow plaintiffs to prove that their position is substantially similar or comparable, right? So we've got 4 different standards up here from 4 different states, and they're, New Jersey and New York are very similar, and Connecticut and Massachusetts are very similar. And so we kind of identified these because we wanted to show you the differences that states, or different directions that states are going, but also how some states are really kind of aligning themselves with others and coming up with fairly similar standards, right? So in Connecticut and Massachusetts, we have a standard that says an employer cannot discriminate in wages based upon the sex of an employee for comparable work, right? Massachusetts, they twist that a little bit and they use the word gender instead of sex, right? Which could potentially expand the types of plaintiffs that are included in that group within Massachusetts, right? They all look at a composite of skill, effort, and responsibility, right? Massachusetts goes a little bit further and defines what comparable work actually means, right? Comparable work is work that is substantially similar and that it requires substantially similar skill, right? And this kind of gets to what we were talking about standards using different language in the standard, but potentially meaning the same thing, right? So here, Massachusetts is defining comparable work as substantially similar work, right? Which brings it much more closely in line with a standard that says substantially similar work, right? So again, this goes back to the idea that we really need to look at how jurisdictions are defining these things in order to be able to compare apples to apples to see whether or not a similar standard is going to be applied across different jurisdictions, right? In New Jersey and New York, right, they frame it a little differently. It's a little bit more cumbersome, right? And the employer could be liable that does not pay an employee who is a member of a protected class at a rate of compensation, including benefits, which is less than the rate paid by the employer to employees who are not members of the protected class for substantially similar work when viewed as a composite of skill, effort, and responsibility, right? And New York is almost identical in that regard in their definition, right? And so some of the things that we're seeing across states that we wanted to point out, right, is states are doing a little bit more work within their laws defining the things that go into substantially similar work, right? So all 4 jurisdictions reference skill, effort, and responsibility, right? Massachusetts goes further and says similar working conditions. But again, there's a certain amount of divergence and then also alignment in these different standards. And as a result, as we're seeing many jurisdictions adopt these slightly looser standards, we're also seeing just a lot more activity in this front from a litigation perspective, as Nusser pointed out with the Oracle settlement. We're just seeing a lot more coming down the pipeline. And as that happens more, I think we're going to get a more clarity regarding how similar some of these state standards that may sound different actually are, and then how different some of the state standards that might actually sound similar are.
Yeah, and to go to that point in terms of Max's point about how there's still kind of confusion on what this means ultimately, even courts are kind of confused, right? So in a recent case, and really they were kind of slow in moving the ball away from that federal standard. A lot of times for the past years, even though a state would have a kind of substantially similar language, they were just sort of using the same standard they had been using, which is the equal pay for equal work standard. So in this case, this Eisenhower case, a female professor alleged that she was underpaid compared to a male professor due to the Culinary Institute's compensation plan. And the lower court said, essentially, no, that, we're going to throw this case out. We don't see enough evidence here. But the higher court in the federal level said, hey, look, like, you made a mistake, right? You analyzed this kind of under the Federal Equal Pay Act standard, right? And the New York law is different, right? One kind of wrinkle that the New York law states that if you're going to have, if there's a pay discrepancy, it has to, and then it's a factor other than sex, that factor has to be job related, right? And that's not really a wrinkle that the Federal Equal Pay Act standard has. And essentially the higher court said, look, you didn't determine that this Culinary Institute compensation plan was something that's particularly job related, right? So you didn't really satisfy your burden under the state standard, right? So they kicked it back to the lower court in terms of like, look, you have to figure this out. So there's kind of slowly becoming a realization that these standards, these state level standards, are more, they have more potential teeth to them than the federal law. So courts are kind of slowly adjusting. That being said, courts still kind of don't, the analysis sometimes is lacking, right? So even after that case, another case within that same federal circuit in the Southern District of New York, Edelman, it analyzed, I think this was between, doctors, and essentially they said that, look, the federal law and the New York law are different, but then if you look at the analysis of the opinion, it kind of uses an equal work standard to say that the defendant had no case, right? So even though there is movement in the court system, there will be, I think, more growth in terms of courts understanding what the difference between equal work versus substantially similar work, and more clarity on that issue. And once that clarity happens, that could also potentially mean like more exposure for employers.
Yeah, and just to add on to what Nasser is saying there is that, I think we're going to see a lot more activity in this area. And hopefully, as we do, as these cases move through the court system, we're going to see a little bit better analysis from the judges regarding what those differences are, right? So that we can really hone in on what is the evidence that is going to be admissible within different jurisdictions regarding defining or meeting that burden to show that they were performing substantially similar work to a different job category that was getting paid better. We're just not quite there yet. We think that we're going to see that more in the next few years as far as really honing in on those differences, right? Now we're looking at a different standard, right? So this standard, equal pay for work of equal value. As Nasser already mentioned, this is a standard that we're seeing in a lot of foreign jurisdictions. It has not been as prevalent in the United States. And this is where workers are performing completely different work, but they can be shown of equal value based upon objective, gender-neutral criteria, and therefore it needs to be paid equally, right? And again, I think Nasser already mentioned the idea behind this standard is to prevent discrimination between traditionally female-dominated versus traditionally male-dominated job categories, right? So you're trying to take away the idea of category and you're trying to look at the underlying work and value it so that you don't end up having, a traditionally male-dominated job like a maintenance person or a groundskeeper getting paid significantly more than a traditionally female-dominated job like a housekeeper, right? So equal value can apply even when jobs are performed under completely different conditions, require different qualifications or skills, and require different levels of effort. This can be a mess for employers as they're looking at trying to figure out what jobs actually have equal value. Now, fortunately, some jurisdictions do have some guidance around how to help do this, right? As we said, this is meant to tackle kind of undervaluation of female-dominated labor, right? And so you can have, individuals who, a guy being paid $10,000 to $12,000 more than a girl, and based upon the fact that it's just slightly different male-dominated position versus female-dominated position, right? It's kind of market rates have been baked into those, right? In the office environment, you have things like legal assistants or secretaries or others that might end up being a female-dominated job versus a male-dominated job and have baked-in biases to their market rates. So we wanted to kind of go into what goes into a little bit into an employer trying to make a quote-unquote job evaluation in order to figure out how to determine what job is of equal value to another, right? So the criteria used to determine equal value, it can include skill, physical effort, management responsibilities, working conditions, and any other factors that are relevant to the specific job or position. It can also include things like jobs value to the company itself from an overall output perspective, right? So in doing this for a jurisdiction that follows this standard, right, most companies are going to have to do what we refer to as a job evaluation, which is a structured way of measuring a specific job's value compared to other positions within the company, right? There are different ways to do this, right? Methodologies, you might just use a ranking system to determine a job's importance to the company, right? This is often the easiest method for small employers to embark on that don't have a ton of different job positions or job categories, right? You could group positions values based upon skill level / management level access, right? So using two different major criteria, valuing those criteria and kind of factoring them together. Most large enterprise organizations, are probably going to want to default to something more like a point factor system, right? Where they give specific job factors a point value and then look at what factors apply to specific jobs and then add those up and weight them, right? A good example, or one example that we're going to give you guys on this call, just to give you an idea of what this process looks like. And let's be clear, this is just one example. This is Spain. If you were in Canada or if you were in any other jurisdiction that does something similar to this, it would be a completely different exercise, right? So, but if you're looking at Spain's kind of job evaluation model with attached weights, right, there's four major categories they're going to look at, right? Nature and function of tasks, right, such as work obligations, physical mental effort, management responsibilities, worker autonomy, right? And that's going to have about 40% of the base weight, right? Educational requirements or conditions, right, are going to have about 20% of the base weight. Professional and training conditions, right, so things that are required outside of education, including knowledge, skills, social skills even, and other kind of educational training factors such as certifications and such, that's going to have about 25% of a weighting towards it. And then working conditions and performance-related factors, right? Including materials, equipment, machines, digital skills, knowledge or proficiency in different languages, non-regulated training, experience, and continuing knowledge education, weighted at about 15%. And I want to point out the fact that in Spain, what we often think of as sort of the skills and nature of a job are all lumped together into a single category and only given a 15% weight. This could be different in different jurisdictions. And so one thing to really hone in on this idea of equal work for equal value is that every jurisdiction is going to have a different idea of how you value work. And it's going to be really important to go through that particular jurisdiction's model analysis in order to get your job evaluations right. And the next slide here is just an example. This is actually provided by the Spanish government. We have a link in the bottom there, right? It's provided by the Spain's Ministry of Labor and Social Economy, and it's available for anybody to download. But it's a good kind of just graph for people to see how the government thinks of scoring jobs, right, in this analysis, right? So this graph shows all the jobs for a particular company sorted according to the number of points scored for each one. It also shows whether each job is predominantly occupied by men or women, and whether it is quote unquote feminized or masculinized respectively, right? And so you can see where all of the different jobs are in their different categories here and the different weights given to them. And this gets towards that idea that they're not just looking at or trying to look at whether or not you're paying one individual comparable to another individual, but often looking at the idea of whether or not particular groups are getting paid comparable to other groups.
Yeah, and kind of factoring into that like final standard, right? Equal pay for equal work. It really, its push is accelerated by the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? The EU Transparency Directive was approved in 2023 and establishes a clear framework for EU member states to apply the principle of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value. So they have 3 years from June 7, 2023 to transpose the directive into law. The implementation dates are likely 2026, but they could enact it earlier. And then all 27 member states are required to adopt the directive. And then I'll talk more about the EU Pay Transparency Directive in future slides. But essentially some of the main requirements is you have to, there's specific metrics you're going to have to publish and report in terms of kind of your raw numbers, in terms of a raw pay gap, but then also kind of do an analysis of whether or not any of those pay gaps that we explained before, whether you can explain away some of those pay gaps due to neutral factors that aren't related to gender. And if you're unable to sort of do that, and you have more than kind of a 5% gap in any specific group, something called a joint pay assessment gets triggered. And we'll probably talk about this, the EU Pay Transparency Directive in a subsequent webinar, because there's kind of a lot to unpack here. But essentially, more obligations trigger if you have these, outlying 5% or higher unexplained pay gaps. And kind of a shameless plug, I think Max and I are doing another webinar tomorrow. This is kind of a last minute webinar we decided to do because Sweden recently is kind of the first EU member state to really propose laws in terms of how this would actually look like in amending its current legislation. And that just happened a couple weeks ago. So Max and I are going to talk more about this, but at a very high level, what they did is they already sort of had pay transparency and pay reporting requirements baked into their law. But in addition, now they've expanded it and amended those sections of the law to also include the requirements of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? So you have in this third bullet point a requirement to submit a payroll report, which has all those metrics on wage differences between women and men, right? And it also adopts the pay transparency requirements that we'll talk about what pay transparency means to close out this webinar, but they've adopted that from the EU directive. In addition, though, they've sort of expanded their own laws to include some things called salary mapping and incorporating that in a salary chart, right, which kind of goes above and beyond what the EU directive is asking for. So if you want more details on this, tune in tomorrow for more details. But yeah, this is kind of what the EU, what an EU member state potentially, looks like after they've adopted the EU Pay Transparency Directive.
Yeah, so that's our plug towards the concept of pay transparency. And I think you could see there, we were referring to the EU Pay Transparency Directive, but we were actually talking about pay data compliance or pay equity analysis requirements within that directive. So we also want to make sure that we touch on a completely different area of pay equity legislation, and these are pay transparency laws, which run tandem with, but are a completely separate legal framework for addressing the concept of equal pay, right? So we talked at the beginning of this presentation about what does it mean? What does equal pay mean, or pay equity mean? And so kind of the first tool that most jurisdictions adopted were equal pay laws, and we went through the different standards associated with those equal pay laws. Another big tool that different jurisdictions and governments are adopting is pay transparency laws, right? These are disclosure laws, right, towards both applicants and workers, right? And some jurisdictional frameworks will have both. They will have an equal pay law combined with a pay transparency law. And in some jurisdictions, they pass them completely separately, right? So what is pay transparency as a concept? Pay transparency is openly communicating compensation information with employees and or candidates and allowing those employees and or candidates to inquire or discuss the employer's compensation practices with each other. It also usually has another component to it, which is the prohibition of an employer from inquiring into a candidate's prior compensation history, right? Then this definition is narrower definition of pay transparency than is sometimes used by other entities. And the idea behind that is, as I said, for example, in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right, they include standards involving both pay transparency and pay equity within that whole umbrella of that directive, right? So sometimes when you see a quote unquote pay transparency law, it is going to include some pay equity components and even some components to some concepts that we're going to talk about either later today or in our next webinar on these topics. And so we just want to make sure that you kind of keep the different concepts separate, but then also understand that they're very kind of interrelated as well, right? So pay transparency ideas come in two different buckets, right? The buckets are those that apply to either current employees or prospective employees, right? So for applicants, prospective employees, these can include salary history bands as well as job posting requirements. And listed here salary ranges, but the reality is posting requirements can and often include more than just a salary range. For example, Washington State has a posting requirement that has at least a dozen other things that need to be included in that job posting, right? Everything ranging from benefits information to time off information, right? These transparency laws can get very detailed in the kinds of information that you're required to include in your job postings. They also vary often on their applicability. So in some jurisdictions, it can apply to every employer. In some, there's a threshold to the number of employees you need to have in order for the posting requirements to apply to you. For current employees, we're looking at salary transparency requirements, i.e., do you have an obligation at a current employee's request to disclose what the current, say, salary band is for their position, or what the current salary band is for the position that they would potentially get promoted into, their boss's position. Also, is there an anti-retaliation measure within the law that prevents any negative activity associated with employees who happen to discuss salaries with each other, right? Also, there can be career progression transparency measures included in the law, i.e., have you provided a current employee with a clear idea that their current job is a client services associate 1, and the next position above that would be a client services associate 2, and the next position above that would be a senior client services associate? Have you given them a clear idea of what their growth opportunities are within the jurisdiction, right? So all of the different states' laws that have a pay transparency component to them will include a multitude of these different factors. So they don't all include all of them. They pick and choose, and even where they include one, say, for example, applicants posting salary ranges, that can include something as simple as you need to post the salary range to you need to post all benefits associated with that position and include itemized lists of all of those things. Right. So what role does this have within the workplace? And I think Nasser, you're going to take this one.
Yeah. So yeah, this is something that's kind of becoming the norm as more and more states continue to adopt the pay transparency, and the EU Pay Transparency Directive, for example, has a sort of concept built in to what EU member states are going to have to adopt. But in the U.S. specifically, the workforce is undergoing a significant shift due to new legislation mandating pay transparency, right? Many states across the U.S. are requiring employers to disclose salary ranges and job postings, increasing the likelihood that employees receive equal pay for equal work. Right? Legislation encourages employers to be more transparent and prospective with current employees, creating a fairer, more equitable work environment. Right? So this kind of pay transparency kind of goes hand in hand with the concept that potentially this is going to lead to more pay equity, right? If people know what compensation ranges are going to be for applicants or for other employees into their company, they're more potentially likely to enforce their right to equal pay rather than being shrouded in mystery. So salary range transparency, fair rewards and recognition, and the use of specialized pay equity software can benefit companies in numerous ways. And these lead to improved financial customer service outcomes, outstanding people outcomes, and greater innovation and adaptability, right? So this is some of the kind of the benefits of potentially using software to analyze, the correct ranges, right? So, and also if you sort of, employers are finding that when they post their salary ranges, potential applicants are more likely to be interested in those jobs, right? I remember recently reading a study shows that the newer generation of people simply won't pursue a job if they don't know exactly what it's going to pay, right? And this is kind of a shift, a generational shift in terms of how we approach pay transparency. And as I was, Max was alluding to earlier, states are enacting legislation to promote greater transparency. And California, for example, enacted the California Equal Pay Act, which requires employers to provide equal pay to employees who perform substantially similar work. Additionally, California's salary history ban prohibits employers from asking job applicants about their salary history, as opposed to other states who may have fewer or no specific requirements regarding salary transparency. As the landscape of labor laws continues to evolve, it's essential for employers to stay informed about the specific requirements in their respective states to ensure compliance. So this, I think this is also kind of becoming, again, the norm, where we're seeing more and more states adopt this almost on like a monthly, weekly basis. Maxfield and I have been posting a couple of, oh my God, this state has adopted a new pay transparency law. And then like quickly the next week, oh, another state has adopted the pay transparency law. So this is happening very frequently. I wouldn't be surprised if, the vast majority of the states enact it. And at some point, companies are like, it's too much work to have kind of a patchwork solution. So let's just go ahead and just, post salary ranges and comply with kind of the more stringent requirements to make sure we're okay across the United States. Again, so some of these states, going to this point, some of these states that have these transparency requirements include California, Colorado, Connecticut, District of Columbia, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Nevada, New York, Rhode Island, Washington, right? And here's kind of a wrinkle too is, even though a state might not have a pay transparency requirement, a county or a city can have a pay transparency requirement, right? So New York City, I think Jersey City has one, and like San Diego has one, right? So they're, even on a local level, you're seeing, states and counties say this is something that's important to them. So even if their state's not on board yet, at a local level, you might have an obligation there. So in the EU, what this means in the EU pay transparency. So the purpose is to grant job applicants the right to access pertinent information for salary negotiations. So the requirements are initial pay disclosure. Employers must provide initial pay or pay range. Disclosure may be in a job posting or interview. And where applicable, the relevant provisions of any collective agreement and job relations should be taken into account. And then also vacancy notices and job titles must be gender neutral. And also there's a salary history ban. And for the EU directive, this is actually a really big shift. So one of the requirements is that in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, workers have the right to receive information in writing on their individual pay level and average pay levels categorized by gender for other workers doing the same work or work of equal value to them, right? So this is actually a really huge requirement that's in the EU Pay Transparency Directive that's kind of potentially giving employers a little bit of heartache, and something that, because that's something that I think employers are going to have to, comply with, even if they're not, over a certain employee threshold, right? So being able to provide employees the average level of pay for people within their group is something it's a really big provision of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? And again, that data has to be timely provided. There's an annual notification for that right. There's salary disclosure permission, and then the worker can also request access to what objective criteria that employer used to determine the pay ranges and career progression, right? So it's a very bold transition for the EU.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that before we jump into pay data compliance, I don't think we can overemphasize how popular pay transparency is right now as a solution to solving the lingering gender pay gap. Since the Equal Pay Act was instituted in 1961, there was a tremendous shift in the gender pay gap over the first, say, 20 plus years, moving from a horrifying like 50 cents on the dollar to still bad, but more respectable, about 80 cents on the dollar. But it has seemed over the last 2 decades to stagnate, right? Making very minor incremental gains year over year. This has not been lost on politicians and legislatures around the country. And it seems like, and globally even, and it seems like one of the favored ways to try to address this right now has been pay transparency laws. So we're seeing new states get on the bandwagon on an almost annual basis. As Nusser pointed out, we're even seeing counties and cities get on the pay transparency bandwagon. This is leading to a myriad web of job posting and disclosure requirements, especially for employers with a national presence, where they're having to contend with pay transparency requirements from a multitude of different jurisdictions. We're seeing a lot of employers that are taking, say, the automakers California approach of, hey, what's the most stringent requirements out there? We're just going to replicate that throughout all of our job postings, because at least then we know we're being compliant. But we're seeing a lot of activity within pay transparency. It really is the one, and it also moves relatively quickly. We're going to get into pay data compliance in a minute. We touched on the EU Pay Transparency Directive and its implementation schedule a little bit earlier in this presentation. And we saw that it has a 3-year run-up, right? And we just now, a year after it was enacted, have the first jurisdiction starting to propose legislation, which means that many employers are going to have a lot of time to figure out how to comply with pay data compliance work. Pay transparency work is coming into effect very quickly. Jurisdictions are proposing laws and passing them in a really quick manner, within months sometimes after they get introduced, and then having them be effective within a few months after that. So there's a lot of movement happening here pretty quickly.
Yeah, so, and I think I see a question, and we'll move it on the EU pay transparency requirements. But if any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll turn to them after the presentation, which will be done pretty shortly. I think the last go ahead, Max.
Oh, no, I was going to say this. We're going to introduce pay data compliance, but we're going to go into it in a lot more detail, the overview, in our next presentation. But we did want to, especially since we had already introduced the EU Pay Transparency Directive in this presentation, we wanted to at least give everybody an idea of one of the other mechanisms outside of pay transparency that jurisdictions are utilizing in order to try to solve their gender pay gaps, as well as some of their other pay gaps, right? And these are pay data compliance measures. And this is a pretty broad umbrella of different legislative compliance reporting tools that different jurisdictions are utilizing in order to try to address this idea of equal pay or pay equity, right? And so pay data compliance, again, we'll go into detail in these different buckets in the next presentation, but it can include everything from requiring a company to perform some sort of raw pay analysis to look at their basic unadjusted gender pay gap. It can require a detailed pay equity analysis, the type of analysis that you really need a company like Trusaic with a sophisticated pay equity software to run for you, including a full regression analysis, looking at your wage influencing factors and grouping your employers into pay analysis groups. It can include something in between, right, as far as running some sort of analysis, but not needing it to be as detailed. It can also include doing something as simple as running a basic analysis and reporting it internally, running an analysis and having it available in case a jurisdiction wants it, running some form of analysis and having it be required to be reported to a government agency. We're going to go over in our next presentation all of those kind of different permutations to what pay data compliance can be. And that's part of the reason we didn't include it in this hour-long presentation, because it's going to take there are a lot of different permutations to pay data compliance that require a little bit more time to go through the different aspects of it. The one thing we did want to introduce to you is how we approach pay data compliance at Trusaic. And Nasser, I think you can take it away from here.
Yeah, so I think this is kind of how we broadly think about it at Trusaic in terms of how to sort of comply with all these sort of regulations, right? And it's a kind of a process we call CART, which stands for collection, analysis, reporting, and transparency. And some of these jurisdictions are going to be more intense on one component of this than another, right? So at the very beginning, right, it's the collection process. Like, what do you have? Where are you storing the data? What are you even keeping track of, right? And so it's taking a look and gathering employee pay or representation data for storage and or filing with those regulatory bodies, right? Once you've collected that data, then you analyze it. So this is conducting a defined workforce analysis, typically involving a pay gap assessment, right? And what you analyze can vary depending on the jurisdiction or what exactly you're looking for. Then finally, reporting, right? How do you present that data? Are you filing with a regulatory body? Are you potentially putting on your yearly report? It depends on the law and regulation, right? So if you share collected data analysis outcomes, which may include internally to employees, externally to regulators, or externally to the public at large, right? And transparency, right? Which is kind of this other concept of how are you being transparent with the applicants and the employees, right? So are you providing correct salary ranges to job applicants? And are you providing career progressions? Are you also, are you able to provide an employee his pay range in comparison to his peers, right? So that's kind of generally a framework we adopt in order to comply with the various reporting requirements.
Perfect. So I think we're at the point where we do actually have a few minutes to address some questions. I see one in the Q&A box, and I can go ahead and start with this one, right? And the question is, are these EU pay transparency requirements in play now or in 2026? The answer is neither to either of those. They will be in play as individual jurisdictions implement them. So jurisdictions have a time frame that they're required to implement them by, which is the last time that they will be implemented. But since this directive is not actually written into each individual EU member state's laws at the moment, they are not in play at the moment. Now, the caveat to Barry's question here is that there are some jurisdictions within the EU that may already have their own pay transparency requirements outside of the EU pay transparency directive. So while this directive is getting implemented, everybody should think about the fact that as we went through Sweden, and we're going to go through Sweden in more detail tomorrow, as Nasser said, is that many of these jurisdictions already have pieces of these requirements. They might already have some form of pay data reporting in an EU member state. They might have some form of pay transparency already. And it's going to be interesting, and it's our deep dive into Sweden tomorrow, how different EU member states either layer their existing requirements with the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Do they abandon their existing requirements and simply adopt the EU Pay Transparency Directive? We're going to see that as each EU member state comes through, and Sweden is just the first country that has proposed it. They haven't implemented yet. This is just their proposal for how to implement the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And then, a shameless plug for our next webinar in this series. It's going to be happening on July 16th, I believe. So if you guys want to be able to go into detail with us on the different types of pay data reporting, paid compliance, as well as our discussion of opportunity parity, which is going to be another concept we introduce we invite you and look forward to having you in that next presentation.